Hi everyone, welcome to another G News podcast. Today we are fortunate to be talking to Arena Williams, who is Labour's spokesperson for Commerce and Consumer Affairs, Building and Construction and Youth. Arena is also the elected member of Parliament for Manurewa and has been since 2020. Hi Arena and welcome to the show.
How good to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And good to be on Waihi.
Yeah man, it's a great place to live. I recommend it to everyone.
I'm very jealous. But of course, Marurewa is the greatest place in Auckland to live. This is a close second.
Perfect. Well, let's just start by talking about banking surcharges. And recently there was a law announcement, a change in the law, that the current government are going to ban surcharges. But should there even be banking surcharges? And secondly, what do you think are the downstream likely impacts on consumers and small retail businesses?
No, there shouldn't be these sorts of surcharges, and it's taken the government a while to act on what they've been signposting for a really long time. But what they've actually changed doesn't do what it says on the tin. These surcharges that they have banned are just going to be pushed on to consumers, but they're not going to be felt evenly. Anyone who pays with their EFTPOS card or cash is now also going to be bearing the cost as it leads to higher prices around the shop. And that might not make a big difference to somewhere like the supermarket where they already have deals with these very big corporates who run these kinds of merchant fees. But it will make a difference to the small business owners where they are being forced to put up their prices around the dairy, around the fish and chip shop. The local RSA will also have to find a way to make sure that they're recouping the costs which are being charged to them by big corporates. This is another example of this national government saying that they're going to be tough on banks, tough on the big corporates, while actually making regulatory decisions which they are asking for and which are the softest versions of something that looks like help for consumers.
Exactly. So we're likely to see inflationary pressure, we're likely to see retail pricing go up, and we're likely to see that in the middle of a cost of living crisis. I mean, is this insanity or?
It is insanity. We're actually seeing the national government that was elected on a promise to ease the cost of living, making it worse with changes like this, because they haven't excluded some of the sorts of charges. They heard from quite a select group of industry when they were consulting on these changes, and it's just another example of making a decision which is favourable to people who make money out of making these sort of charging systems available to consumers, whilst at the same time saying to consumers that they're helping. We're going to see prices going up for people who pay cash. For, say elderly people, people on the pension who would usually go into their local dairy or their local fruit and vegetable shop, they are going to be bearing now some of these charges so that other people can pay with say PayWave. And, it's really good to see the government making it easier for people who like to pay with PayWave, like to pay with a credit card. And they could have made different decisions that would have made that easier and cheaper. I heard this crazy argument from the Minister of Commerce. He says he needed to leave some profit in the system so that fintechs could make a dime out of this. I mean, are New Zealanders really meant to believe that the people that he's acting in the interests of by leaving a big whack of profit there for large corporate interests to make money out of people buying and selling things? The small business owners pay this, mums and dads who are going to the shops, so that new and innovative companies have a way into the market? No, it's going to be the big corporate interests that have always existed there.
So on the corporate interests, banking interests in particular, we're talking about Scott Simpson here from the National Party, and he's behind those surcharges, but he's also presided over a law change that's a retrospective law change, which is going to effectively amend a law so that an existing and current class action lawsuit that represents 170,000 New Zealanders, banking customers, is suddenly scrapped, and they won't get as much compensation as they might have been entitled to. I mean, what do you make of that kind of retrospective lawmaking on behalf of big banks?
It's no good, and this isn't how we should be making law in New Zealand. But I can imagine your listeners listening to this and saying, hang on, that can't be right. We must be over-egging it here. We're not. This is a situation where there are thousands of New Zealanders who are owed thousands of dollars because of disclosure requirements. And they're actually owed that now. So the law is in their favour. Between 2015 and 2019, there were mistakes made. They got an email saying that they owed one amount when in fact they owed a different amount, or something along those lines. And so they might have received a payment in their bank account which was unexplained, which related to this period, and that's how they found out. Or they may never have found out because the two banks that are in question here, ANZ and ASB, haven't actually disclosed how many customers are facing this. So it might be you and me. I had a mortgage over that period with the ANZ Bank. Many people who are watching this might in fact be in this situation. We don't know. And so there are these people who are owed money right now, and the government is making a change to what is a pretty innocuous bill, really, to amend the Triple CFA, but it's buried in here deep. And it seems that once the public consultation had closed and once Cabinet had already made a decision not to make this retrospective, not to take away the debts that were owed by the banks to their customers like you and I, then the New Zealand Banking Association gets involved. Then we have private meetings with the banks and between the officials. That's when things get changed and when the government starts making a decision behind closed doors that take away these thousands of dollars owed to mortgage holders and to loan holders.
The New Zealand Banking Association claimed that there would be something of the order of about a $13 billion liability and that the entire banking industry could fall down if something wasn't done to save them here. What do you make of this? Is this just theatrics, or have they got a point?
They did make this claim, and in fact, it was then reiterated by the officials who were advising the government on this. So I've asked some questions about how those calculations were made. I think it's really important that the Reserve Bank front to the select committee that's inquiring about this at the moment, but we haven't been able to make sure that that is what's going to happen. It might still happen, and that is an important part of the public record here because you want to make sure that these numbers have some veracity. But when I do my own analysis, you have to look at, well, are there more claims that could exist that we haven't heard about? And this is coming to the end of the period where people could in fact make a claim anyway. So even if there are customers out there, and it might be some of your listeners who are owed money, if it goes beyond a certain period and that's coming up now, they can't actually bring a claim anyway. And so we know that what's on the table and being negotiated at the moment between the banks and the litigators who have brought the claim on behalf of the customers is nowhere near that. They were offered an offer to settle within the hundreds of millions. So we know that it's not the billions. So we know that it's not this big systemic risk to the banking system. And in fact, both of those banks posted a pretty healthy profit in the last few years that was beyond this amount. So we've really got to ask ourselves, in whose interest is it for, say, the New Zealand Banking Association to be upping the number and upping the stakes for a government making choices here?
Okay, supermarkets.
A good topic, yep.
Is it just a big pillow fight and between friends and a duopoly? Is it a pretend big stick? I mean, is there actually anything that you think the government is doing that's actually going to have the effect of making our groceries cheaper?
It's a great question because we did have a National Party and a Prime Minister, Christopher Luxon, out on the electoral campaign trail a couple of years ago now, promising that they were going to take action on the cost of living and that grocery was in their sights. And I'll take you back. This was on the back of Labor beginning this work on a market study into the grocery sector that found excess profits, $1 million a day coming out of the sector. And this is, it's not a highly profitable industry. This is families buying bread and milk who are then contributing to excess profits in this sector. So there was a lot of heat and light from the National Party on inflation around these basic food products and the amount of profit that was going out of Kiwis' back pockets and into supermarkets. However, it then took them 18 months to announce what they were going to do about the sector. And in fact, that announcement was, we're going to ask the industry to tell us, government, what they would like. So they're now going to have on their hands a situation where industry have written to them and been and said, please, Minister, I would like lots of good incentives from the New Zealand taxpayer so that I can compete as a third entrant in the supermarket sector in New Zealand. And the problem with that is it's pretty limited. We know that in a lot of the parts of the country where competition is very low and people are paying far too much for their groceries, reports of butter being over $20 in some Queenstown areas, for instance, in those places, a third entrant who's engaging in this sort of government process is not going to come to town and fix the competition issues. We need wider scale reform and a government that's prepared to look at this soberly and think about the kind of information that Labour's study into the sector actually got out and proved that New Zealanders are paying more than, say, people in Australia, people in the UK, and what are those things that we could do to make changes that would bring down prices? Things like what this government has been talking around planning changes, making it easier to compete in town centres with the bricks and mortar, and then also some of the other New Zealand solutions that have been pitched up as a way to grow domestic competition within the market. But those aren't things that the government has focused on yet.
Let's talk about building and construction. What do you think when it comes to building and construction that this government will be remembered for?
It's a good question because this government's record of seeing 18,000 job losses in the construction sector since they took office is a blight on their record, and it's one they have to own. Who are those people? They're young people. They're New Zealanders who trained under Labour through the free apprenticeships. They are people who come from all walks of life and can make a go of it in the building and construction sector because it's something where you get hands-on practical experience from day dot. You can be a 17-year-old, you can be a 35-year-old, you can be a 55-year-old. Doesn't matter what sort of experience you've had, these are people who believed that they could learn something and make something for themselves and then go on to own their own businesses. Those are exactly the people who are part of the 47,000 New Zealanders who left the country last year. This is a government that has seen an extraordinary mass exodus. And why? It's because these people don't have work. They aren't able to participate in our housing market. They're not able to buy a first home for themselves. And that has intergenerational impacts. We're not going to be able to get those back. So it's our job as people living in New Zealand, loving New Zealand, to think about how we will rebuild that sector when inevitably things turn around and we're back to building houses. We know that the building and construction sector lags behind economic growth, and so it'll take us another 2 years probably to rebuild those people into the jobs that we need them to do to build houses back again.
The government has actually overseen a massive slump in building activity at a time when they really should be promoting growth and getting things stimulated and happening. What are the impacts that you've seen and heard on the ground in the building and construction industry?
You're entirely right to point to saying one thing about an infrastructure pipeline where there weren't bipartisan support to continue to big infrastructure projects, and cutting the real infrastructure builds that were going on, cutting 200 school builds, cutting $1.5 billion out of the public housing build. Those are the things which were keeping the local sector going. And when you have builders in Auckland coming off City Rail Link, coming off, say, the Manukau Super Clinic build, they're then looking around and saying there is no pipeline of work because that residential sector is in a complete slump and the government hasn't kept up its end of the bargain. We need government to act as a ballast for the construction sector in a downturn. The industry at the moment is crying out for government work. Architects, engineers are pointing out that this is the lowest it's ever been in a generation for government work for their services, and so they're going offshore too. And those tradies, the electricians, the plumbers, they're all saying that because of this downturn, they've lost a huge amount of the younger people in their workforce. And now electricians are expecting 20% of their workforce to retire every year. We're not replacing those people. And so government has really let us down in the next 3 years, 4 years, 5 years when things pick back up.
We recently saw some widening of the products that are supplied to the New Zealand construction and building industries. But the idea there is that maybe this will bring down the overall costs of building. Yet wasn't this something that came out of a Commerce Commission recommendation? And who commissioned that study? So when it comes to taking credit here, who really kicked the ball off here?
It's a really interesting point you raise about building products. It's something that Labor has been quite supportive of, and that's because it did start from that Commerce Commission study into building products that Labor kicked off with the Commerce Commission and made it a real focus. But we are in a situation where now we're watching the government put a lot of juice in their housing program into this. And I don't know if you've read, say, Abundance by Ezra Klein or some of that supply side economics thinking, but that has definitely impacted the way that the government is trying to build more houses. And that's something we need to do, but it can't be an either or. The fact that they've cut very deeply the public housing builds and they've now pushed a huge amount of the building into the community housing providers, which they're saying to government, look, we cannot do this. Our model is all based on needing capital to actually fund us, and we're capital constrained at the moment. You're either going to have to put in land or capital, or give us really easy access to borrowing. It means that they're making these good changes on one hand, but they're not actually feeding the sector on the other hand and doing their part to do that. And they've overseas this loss in construction jobs. So when you look at the overall pipeline of houses that are being built, it's no surprise that I then go and talk to community housing providers in South Auckland and they say, wow, we got that consent very fast from Auckland Council because we are the only ones building here. There are 18 new houses going in Mangere, and that is amazing, but they're the only guys who are doing anything new in the residential space. And when you look at what actually we need, you know that there are more and more families needing housing in South Auckland right now that, alongside population shifts, there are also people who are still chronically underhoused and there is chronically rising homelessness. If the government is trying to fix that problem with making more building products available in the market, even a very positive read of what they're doing there is going to take a long, long time to bed in. But on the top of that, we've now got the Building Construction Minister, Chris Penk, out there saying this is not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve it all. When at the election, they were saying, this is it. This is the thing that we're going to make sure changes the market for the long term.
You mentioned the community housing providers there, and what we hear from the National Party a lot is that they don't care, they're agnostic, it doesn't matter who makes the houses or builds them, and that they've leveled some playing field here. But when it comes to the overall supply and how many houses are being built, what if we step back to changing the role of Kaianga Ora and turning them into more of a landlord than an organisation that builds state houses, what's been the real impact on the housing supply in state housing and social housing?
It's incredibly short-sighted. We no longer have a pipeline of those builds that are really important for getting families into new homes and turning older, wet, cold houses into new, more dense houses that can house more people. There's none of that going on. And it's not only had this big impact on the building construction sector, but those families who, say have been moved out of their public housing so that it can be redeveloped between the last government and this one, who were guaranteed that they would be able to return to those homes, now all lose those guarantees. So they're out in the private rental market and they're finding it harder and harder to have long tenancies and secure tenancies. Principals in my area tell me every time I go and visit them that the rate of churn of families who are signing up new and who or are coming back into the school is the highest that it has ever been. It's a no-brainer, and a government that says it's interested in social investment and putting money into young people so that they're not funding, the longer-term harms of things like needing to move around and not having a stable school, they need to focus on this particular problem. And so not having those new public housing builds all really exacerbates this. I recently got an official information Act request back, and it showed me just the impact in Manarewa of the government's new policy around how it deals with tenants in my area. 46% of the tenants in my area are, say, Pacific families, but of the evictions that have been taken since this government took office, more than 65% of the evictions are applying to Pacific families. And we've got to ask ourselves, why is that? Why are families in this situation ending up where they cannot pay their rent? Why is enforcement action being taken against families with a large number of children? The effect is that 80 children have been moved out of state housing, and the government does not track where they go. We do not know if they're in cars. We do not know if they're in tents because the government says it's disinterested in that.
Auckland issues. We've seen an absolute explosion in homelessness,
That's it.
and the impacts fall most heavily on Maori and Pacific peoples. We're in a cost of living crisis. Unemployment is going crazy. Now, that recent insights report that came out from HUD that really put the cause at the foot of the emergency housing policy that the government has implemented in order to make a waiting list smaller. Could you comment on that and what you're hearing and really seeing happening in Auckland?
You and I know that is really hurting our cities and our communities. I mean, in Auckland, the level of homelessness is extraordinary, but the level of youth homelessness is the thing that I think we can really, say this is not okay and this is not something that anyone in New Zealand wants to see. This violates the social contract that we as New Zealanders think is important when we have 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds on the street. And that's exactly the people who we're seeing sleeping on Queen Street at the moment, sleeping in K Road, because advocates like Aaron Hendry are seeing them at Kickback, and he's saying that they're not getting the support for transitional housing that there was under Labour because of this government's ideological commitment to see those transitional housing options taken away from people. They crow about that. They say it's a good thing in their record that there aren't young people in motels. But where are they? They have no idea that these young people are actually instead sleeping on the streets, and it's not good enough.
Let's keep talking about this. Aaron Henry, he says this has got to stop.
Yeah.
I was there during the protests and he's like, this has got to stop.
Yes.
And what we're hearing is, there are a range of factors that contribute to rough sleeping, and this could just be one of them, but we're very proud of how this waiting list is getting smaller. Well, what does it feel like sitting in Parliament watching that kind of deflection happening, and every time that someone tries to get through to the government, that they are causing homelessness? Even the Auckland City Mission is telling them, but they seem to have deaf ears. What does this feel like as an opposition MP?
It's desperately out of touch that ministers can claim that, we had that you can go to MSD or to Kāinga Ora and ask for help if you're in this situation, when we're hearing again and again from advocates and from the young people themselves that they have gone, they have asked for help, and then there are no options available to them, and so they're ending up on the street. I mean, do these ministers think that a 16-year-old is choosing to sleep at the bus stop? I met a young woman in my electorate at the beginning of this year. She was 16 years old, and twice she had ended up in a bus stop because of housing in her family that was unreliable. It wasn't that she didn't have a solid roof over her head. That hadn't been the case for her since she was 12 years old. It was the fact that in her usually moving around her family, that renting situations within that family had gotten so hard for the other people, the so-called stable adults in her life, that she had nowhere to go. Māti Huru Huru, they're an amazing organisation. They have 2 homes for young people where they support them into living situations where they have nowhere else to go. They had 2 places. They opened them up for applications, and just of the eligible teenagers, these are teenagers who have nowhere else to go, no adults to stand in for them, 350 applications. And so there are still 348 of those kids who have nowhere better to go and who have no other options, and yet there is no solutions being proffered by this government. It is a crisis, and it is getting worse in our communities. Aucklanders can see it. The choice now is that we have a government who is throwing up their hands and saying things are getting better. Things are not getting better, and so if we don't believe that, we need to work on our own solutions in the community until we can make a change at the election.
Let's talk about youth. The Minister for Youth, is he missing it in action? We're seeing youth unemployment rising to over 23% now. And what's he actually doing about things at the moment? What do you see?
Not one cabinet paper, not one helpful suggestion about how policy might change, not one visit with one of the organisations which has been defunded in his choices about which youth organisations will continue. We are seeing a youth minister who is happy to go along to openings of positive things for youth and of Youth Week and to speak about youth issues when they're in the media, and yet is not taking any action when youth unemployment is rising, and it's rising worse in Auckland. 1 in 4 young people in this city are without work and they're without training opportunities to go alongside it. That is a blight on any government, and I'm particularly worried about the way that youth unemployment is rising for Māori and for Pacific and for women. During the global financial crisis, and we'll remember this, young people were competing with older people for jobs in the workplace. There was a rapidly declining market for to be able to get into the kind of work that young people need to get the experience and to get the jobs. And so during that period, we should have learnt the lesson that these young people will go overseas and they will not return home. This is something which is playing out over again, and it's happening worse. And it's happening in different areas. At the time of the global financial crisis, it was in the regions. This time, it's in our city, in Auckland. And so if we don't provide those kinds of opportunities for training, and yet we've got a government that is rapidly reorganising the vocational trades and training sector to make employers less involved in the skills they need, not more involved, we're then going to see exactly what we saw after the global financial crisis, which was a deep scarring for a generation of young people who either couldn't return home because there weren't jobs for them, or stayed in the market, didn't get the skills they needed, and then were stuck in low paid, pretty hopeless situations of work and prolonged savings before they could get into their own home.
Let's talk about Winton. And Winton's a building project that's in a electorate very near you. And you have said that you've got a special interest in that
Just down
project.
the road from my house.
And you gave a fierce speech in December about that, and it went crazy on social media, and we all saw you really fired up about it. This is to do with fast track consenting and private gain. What is the story there with that Winton project, and why are you interested in it?
It is very close to where I live. It's a South Auckland project. It was one that was rejected by Labour governments twice because, there are lots of things that go into a big project. You need to pay for the roads, you need to pay for the playgrounds, you need to make sure that the people living there have the things that they need to live good lives. And Labour is pro-housing. We want to build more houses. We want to make sure that South Aucklanders have homes in these areas. But this was a project that had been included at the last minute in legislation, which stood to benefit a very, very small subset of New Zealanders. In fact, just a few, including former National Party MPs who are on the board of this company. It just feels like a huge step in the wrong direction for New Zealand's legislative system. That speech for me was a bit pointy-headed, to be honest. It was about the parliamentary procedure and the way that we use our laws. They must be for the public benefit. You should not be able to legislate in a way which creates a huge private benefit for certain individuals, let alone a large company with a history there of working very closely with one particular political party. And that was what I was speaking about there. I really feel passionate about this. I think, getting away from the issues about housing and about how we facilitate the growth of good communities and places where people can live and buy their own homes and raise their families, because that's on one side, and I really want us to see doing that more. But this was also about, we have to have some faith in our constitutional protections here in New Zealand. We had a huge debate and ability in Parliament to be able to get into the politics of this, but no ability to see which projects were on the fast track list. We want to be able to use, special considerations and special lawmaking to be able to crack some of the really difficult and gnarly issues in our planning laws. But, this was going in a direction which I don't think most New Zealanders want to see any parliamentarians going down, where we end up in a situation where we're sort of captured by particular interests within any kind of system.
Exactly. So lastly, final question. If you have a message for the audience listening to you today, what would it be?
Well, for starters, it would be to vote in the by-election in Tāmaki Makaurau. We have a by-election on at the moment. Very few people know that it's on. And we have a government hell-bent on changing the rules so fewer people in the next general election will be able to vote. the point that I would draw those two together on is that there will be low turnout in the Tamaki Makaurau by-election, and that means fewer people have their say. Me, I'm a Labour Party politician. I'm in the business of making sure that working people are having their say and their interests are represented in Parliament. But this government has made it harder for them to vote. They've made it harder for 137,000 people who changed their address within the electoral period, that's within the 3 years, to vote. And in my electorate, people live in it for an average of 2 years. So that's the whole population turning over every time. You know why that makes a difference? It's because fewer and fewer people who I want to represent, who I want to have their say, are going to be able to cast their vote at the ballot box next time. I think that is a real shame for our democracy. And so starts at home, starts now. If you're watching this, make sure that if you have people in your family and your friends who can vote in the Tamaki Makaurau by-election, that they are going to do so and that they're all up to date. And then make sure that you are also yourself eligible to vote and that you can have a say in this process. Because, you know, things like that speech about Winton, things like this homelessness policy of the government where they are seeing more and more people on the streets, these are all deeply political decisions. If only a small subset of our people can actually have a say and can choose the politicians who are making these sorts of decisions, then you and me cannot be surprised when this is what happens and when our communities and our town centres change and when there is more crime because people are more desperate and when the cost of living is rising for basics, but when things are getting easier for people at the top. We need to make sure that everyone is having a say and that we are making decisions for the many, not the few.
Arena Williams, thank you so much for joining us on G News today. It's been fantastic to hear your heartfelt and genuine comments on all of these major issues that are really sucking into us and hurting us at the moment. We need to do something about it, and you're a force for the good. So thank you very much, and
Thank
love
you
to
for
have you back
having
here
me.
again sometime.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah, right.